Hello. Bond Knitting have made this video to help you get the best from your Elite. Sue will show you how to set up your Elite, how to cast on, and how to knit some practice knitting. First, push the clamp through the hole at the front of your Elite and secure firmly to the table. Do the same with the second clamp, making sure the bottom edge of the Elite is level with the front edge of the table. Slide the row counter onto the lower back rail of the needle bed and position it in the center. Slide the carriage onto the top rail of the needle bed. Push the yarn feed into the center hole and the yarn spring into the right-hand hole. Set your row counter to 0, 0, 0. Before we cast on, let's see the different needle positions. Here we have holding position, forward working position, and non-working position. These needle positions will be referred to from now on. Now let's see how to cast on. Push the needles you want to cast on into holding position. Check that there are equal numbers on either side of the center mark. Sue is using 70 needles. Line the center slot of the cast-on hem between the center needles. Lay the hem back on the needle bed. Use the single-prong transfer tool to open all the latches of the needles you are casting on. Cut a length of shearing elastic and lay it into the open needle hooks. Tie the ends together. Making sure the elastic stays in the hooks, fold the hem over and push it right back against the needle bed. Place the yellow card onto the needle bed and push the needles back against it until they are all in the forward working position. Remove the yellow card. Take key plate 4 and insert it into the carriage, making sure the slot fits over the bollard with the number 4 in the top right-hand corner. Using the ball of yarn in the box, pull out several lengths from the center. Thread up by sliding the yarn through the yarn feed, up through the yarn spring, and through the center slot in the front fairing. Slide the left-hand yarn stop onto the lower back rail. The V will be pointing to the center of the needle bed. Position it so that the V is in line with the last working needle on the left. Hold the loose end of the yarn until you have knitted the first stitch. Take the carriage slowly across until it has cleared the last needle. You have now cast on. Attach the clip to the loose end of the yarn. Slide the right-hand yarn stop on as before, so that the V lines up with the first working needle on the right. Knit for 10 rows. Make sure that the carriage clears the needles at the end of each row and that the yarn is running freely at all times. Sue is knitting on waste yarn so that the ribbing can be attached after the main knitting is completed. At the end of 10 rows, break off the waste yarn. Rethread the carriage with your main yarn as before, so that you are ready to commence with your main knitting. After the first row, attach the clip to the loose ends. Now let's see how to decrease. Using the single prong transfer tool, bring the needle forward and transfer the stitch onto the next needle. Push the empty needle into the non-working position. Knit 2 rows. Pull the needle out and lift the stitch onto the next needle. Note that Sue is holding her knitting back with her other hand, and that she's keeping the transfer tool in line with the needle at all times. You can use the 3-prong transfer tool in the same way for fully fashioned decrease. Use the 3-prong transfer tool to pull out the 3 end needles. Lift the stitches off and move them in 1 needle. You now have 2 stitches on the 3rd needle in from the end. Continue knitting. You have now decreased 1 stitch fully fashioned. You can decrease on both edges at the same time if you wish. Now let's increase 1 stitch at a time. At the beginning of a row, bring forward an extra needle. Check that the latch is open and push into the working position. Knit the row. You have now increased 1 stitch. Always remember to adjust your yarn stops after you have increased or decreased. Sue will show you 2 methods for casting off. Let's begin with a chain stitch cast off. First, remove the yarn from the yarn spring and the yarn stop. Transfer the end stitch across to the next needle. Bring this needle forward and place the yarn into the hook. Draw the needle back, knitting the 2 stitches together. Continue casting off your stitches in this way until you have cast off the whole row. So that the cast-off edge is not too tight, push the needles well back when knitting to form a large stitch. To help take the weight of the hem, you can hook up cast-off knitting onto empty needles. At the end of the row, leave sufficient yarn to draw through the last stitch. The second method is the back stitch cast off. and is used on finished edges that will be visible. Leaving yarn 3 times the width of your knitting, break it off and thread through a darning needle. Insert the needle into the second stitch, bringing it back through the first stitch. Pull the yarn through. Now, into the third stitch and back through the second, and so on across the row. When the last stitch is reached, pull the yarn through to fasten off. Remove the knitting by bringing all the needles into the hold position. And then back into the non-working position. Remove the cast-on hem by gently easing the knitting apart, carefully snipping out the elastic as you go. Sue is now going to show you how to put the ribbing onto your knitting. Bring forward the same amount of needles you used for your main knitting. Hook up the first row of main colour knitting onto the needles with the wrong side facing you. The waist knitting will be hanging down behind. Finish the row and push the knitting to the back of the needles. Take back every third needle into the non-working position, thus removing the stitch. Rehang the cast-on hem. Make sure the latches are open before laying the elastic in the hooks. Push the cast-on hem to the back of the needles. Now push the needles into the forward working position. Rethread the carriage with main yarn and knit the required number of rows. You now have a series of ladders. With the latch tool hook down, pick up the stitch that you removed from the needle. Turn the hook over and push the stitch behind the latch. As you bring the tool back, hook up the first bar of the ladder. Draw the bar through the stitch. Hook up the remainder of the ladder in the same way. When you reach the top of the ladder, hook the new stitch onto the empty needle. Use the back stitch method to cast off. Remove the knitting from the needles to expose the waste yarn. pull out the waste yarn. Remove the knitting from the cast-on hem by snipping out the shearing elastic. Sue is now going to show you how to knit the basic pattern stitches, starting with a lace stitch. Use the transfer tool to transfer one stitch onto its adjacent needle. Bring the empty needle into the hold position. Knit one row. Push the needle back to the forward working position with the latch open. Knit one row. You have now made one lace eyelet. You can continue to make more lace eyelets in this way to make a lace pattern. Sue is making a V-shaped lace pattern. You can position your lace pattern anywhere on the knitting. Here is the finished pattern. Now Sue will show you the tuck stitch. This is a very simple stitch which creates texture. Push into the holding position the needles required to carry the tuck. Knit 2 rows. Pull down on the knitting and push the needles back, checking that the latches are open. Knit 1 row. Select the needles for the next row of pattern, pushing them into the holding position. Knit 2 rows. Pull down on the knitting and push the needles back into the forward working position. Check that the latches are open. Knit 1 row. Continue in this way until you have completed your tuck stitch pattern. With tuck stitch, the reverse side becomes the right side. There are hundreds of tuck patterns you can make. Fair Isle is a method of knitting 2 or more colours in 1 row, sometimes called jacquard knitting. Bring into the holding position the needles where you require the contrast colour. Sue will knit a contrast colour on every 3rd needle. Always knit the main colour stitches first by taking the carriage across the row. Now knit in the contrast colour by hand. Make your stitches the same size as the main knitting. Select the needles for the 2nd pattern row. Sue is moving one needle to the right to form a diagonal pattern. This is how the back of the knitting looks, with the contrast floats being carried between the pattern stitches. Now Sue will show you how to knit a 6-stitch cable. Remove onto waste yarn 1 stitch on each side of the needles that you're going to use for the cable. Push the empty needles into the non-working position. Knit 2 rows. Using the 3-prong transfer tool, remove the 3 right-hand stitches and hook the tool onto a needle like this. Now using the second transfer tool, transfer the 3 left-hand stitches onto the 3 empty needles. Then transfer the other 3 stitches across to the 3 needles on the left. You have now twisted a cable. Push the 6 needles into the forward working position, making sure that the latches are open. Bring forward an extra needle on each side to make it easier to knit the next row. Knit 6 rows. Repeat the crossing over of the stitches every 6 rows, just like this. Latch up the ladder using the latch tool. Insert the hook into the stitch held on waste yarn. Hook up the first bar of the ladder as for ribbing, forming a new stitch. Continue up the ladder. Note how Sue is holding the knitting down with her other hand. For a long cable, you will find it easier to latch up the ladder in stages, every 3rd or 4th cable. When you reach the top of the ladder, hook the stitch onto the empty needle. Do the same with a second ladder. Remove the waste yarn when you have finished the cable. And this is what the cable looks like from the right side. Now Sue will show you how to knit Intarsia. This technique is used for picture knitting. Open the handle by releasing the catches and turn the key plate around so that the number 4 is now in the bottom left-hand corner and the slot is over the bottom bollard. Knit across the row to position your needles in the forward working position. Lay the yarns into the needle hooks where you want the different colours to be knitted. Make sure the loose ends are nearest the carriage. Hold the yarn at the downward angle with one hand and take the carriage across with the other. Now lay the yarns into the needle hooks in the other direction. Cross the yarns to prevent a hole. Knit the row. This is how you cross over the yarns between and underneath the needles where the colours change. As you knit the row, let the yarn run through your fingers. To close the hole on the first row, use the latch tool to pull the loose end through the crossover stitch. Sue has moved one needle to the right to form a diagonal pattern. If you've had any problems knitting your practice piece, this next section has been designed to help you. If the carriage jams in the middle of a row, don't try to force it. Open the handle by releasing the catches, remove the key plate, and take the carriage back to the start of that row. You now need to unravel the row. Do this by pulling the yarn sideways and lifting it out of the needle hooks back to the start of the row. Check that the stitches are either in the hooks or behind open latches. With the key plate back in the carriage, take up the slack and knit the row. A dropped stitch is easy to pick up. Using the transfer tool, pick up the dropped stitch and put it back onto the empty needle. Push the needle forward so the stitch is behind the latch. Pick up the bottom loop and put it onto the hook. Knit the stitch through. Do exactly the same with the second loop. Pull the knitting down. By following these simple instructions, you will be able to create the garments in the basic pattern book. You'll be amazed by how creative you can be.
This video will show you how to set up your Elite ribber bed. It must be used in conjunction with your instruction book, which gives additional detail. The ribber bed attaches to your existing Elite, which then becomes the main bed. When the ribber bed is attached, you can knit a wide range of rib stitch patterns. To attach the ribber, turn the main bed upside down and remove the feet and screws from both ends. Using the same screws, attach the two brackets for the ribber onto the bottom of the bed, making sure they are the right way round. Clamp the main bed to the table in the usual way, making sure the bottom edge of the black metal chassis is in line with the edge of the table to give maximum clearance. Now is the time to check the main bed is level. An easy way of doing this is by taking a length of yarn as long as the bed and stretch it tightly across the front rail from end cap to end cap. If the bed is level, the front rail will touch the yarn in the middle. If there is a gap, you must pack up the bed until it does just touch the yarn. Slide some cord onto the front middle foot. Once you are sure the main bed is level, attach the ribber bed by inserting the two threaded studs through the slots in the brackets. Rest the ribber at the bottom position of the slots. Put the locking washers and wing nuts onto the studs loosely. Insert the rubber spacers between the brackets and the bed by sliding them in from the top. The rubber spacers set the correct gap and must be left in position permanently, except when knitting fisherman's rib. There are 3 positions for the ribber bed: bottom position, middle position, top position. Lift the bed up to the top position and tighten the locking wing nuts. The gap between the beds should be the same all along. If it is smaller in the middle, your main bed will not have been level to start with, and you will need enough card under the centre foot until the gap is the same the whole length of the bed. To put the carriages on, slide both carriages onto the beds from one end. Open the main bed carriage handle and screw the ribber fairing onto the carriage using the 2 screws and washers supplied. Now open the ribber bed carriage handle and attach the fairing by screwing the remaining screw into the centre slot loosely so that the fairing can be slid out. Close and lock both handles. The yarn nozzle has raised lines around it and should be pushed into the hole of the fairing through the rubber ring, far enough so that the raised lines touch the rubber ring. Check the height of the nozzle is correct. The ends should be as close to the needles as possible without touching them. Put the yarn stops and row counter on the main bed in the normal way and attach the yarn feed and yarn spring to your main bed carriage. You are now ready to cast on. Slide the fairing out of the ribber bed carriage. Remove the ribber carriage completely and drop the bed to the bottom position on the brackets. We are going to show you the circular cast on, which is used for knitting welts and cuffs. It is knitted over 4 rows. Using the needle pusher, bring forward alternate needles on the main bed. Hang the weighted hem onto these needles using shirring elastic in the normal way. Fold the hem over so that the needles are at the top of the slots. Push the needles back to forward working position. Making sure the hem is hanging free, return the ribber bed to the top position. Check the centre needles of both beds are in line and the 2 white knobs are in contact with the main bed end caps. Tighten the wing nuts. Slide the ribber carriage onto its bed behind the fairing so that the slot slides behind the screw. There is no need to tighten this screw. Insert the red key plate in the main bed carriage only. Close and lock the handle. Using the double-eyed transfer tool, thread up the carriage, making sure the yarn hangs down behind the cast-on hem. Knit 1 row. Pull down on the hem. Only the main bed will knit. Pick up the loops and hook them onto every alternate needle on the ribber bed using the stitch tool. Remove the red key plate from the main carriage and put it in the ribber carriage. Knit the 2nd row and pull down on the hem. Only the ribber bed will knit. Push the needles on the main bed into forward working position and check all the latches are open. Remove the key plate from the ribber carriage and put it into the main carriage. Knit the 3rd row and pull down on the hem. Only the main bed will knit. Push the needles on the main bed into forward working position and check all the latches are open. Put a red key plate in both carriages and knit the 4th row. Pull down on the hem. Both beds will have knitted. You can now continue to knit the rib normally. Needles do not need to be put into forward working position. After 6 rows, use the edge weight hangers to attach the weights. These should be moved up every 10 or 15 rows. Once you have knitted the correct amount of rows for your rib, transfer the stitches on the ribber bed onto the main bed using the double-eyed transfer tool. Remove the nozzle, unhook the yarn and take off the carriages. Drop the ribber bed to the bottom position. Leaving the yarn threaded through the nozzle, reassemble your main bed carriage and continue to knit in the normal way. The Elite Ribber enables you to knit a host of rib stitches, such as basket weave, Eiffel Tower, diagonal mock cable, fisherman's rib, etc., by using a different combination of needles.